Tides of Numenera was a game that I had to be told about by a coworker. Now, I knew nothing about it, which is surprising because I love Planescape Torment, and knowing that there was a spiritual successor releasing soon was very nearly orgasmic. I pre-ordered, which I never ever do, and as soon as there was a playable beta of the game, I jumped on that shit like a homeless man on a half-eaten sandwich. It was cool. You know, the open area was unique, and I liked the way you could either choose to fight the sorrow in your mind or interact with memories to dispel them. After escaping the prison of my mind, I was introduced to an interesting albeit long text adventure, similar in construction to what Pillars did, but more in depth. The lore was interesting and I was excited to see what the game had in store for me. I forced myself to stop playing because I didn't want to go too far into the game, only to get bored with it when the full game finally released, because I had to go and just do it all over again. Little did I know that they would scrap almost everything from the original opening and streamline it to what I think is the detriment of the experience. That's not to say I don't understand why they did it. It is a much less daunting experience to not be confronted with that much text up front. But the thing about this game is, if you don't like to read, this game isn't for you. Even though they removed quite a bit of text from the beginning, there's still so much exposition front-loaded into this game that people who were longtime fans of Planescape all had very similar complaints. The game takes too long to start. This could explain why when I first played the release of the game, I quit after about 11 hours in. Well, not so much quit as got distracted by other titles releasing at the time. So recently I was sitting around my apartment stressing out about various shit in my life when I had a sudden urge to play the game. See, when I get engrossed in a story, all the little nagging things that get in my head get reduced to background noise, and for the length of the playtime I'm able to calm down. My legs stop shaking. My headache goes away. For a couple of hours, I'm at peace. And man, am I glad I came back, because Tides of Numenera has got to be now at the top of my list of all-time greatest RPG experiences. And in this mammoth-sized video essay, I'm going to tell you all the reasons in exhaustive detail as I try to convince you to go out and play this game for yourself. So let's dig in, shall we? There are many systems in Tides of Numenera. Some of them are obvious, like your stat pools, and some are a bit harder to understand without context, like some of the skills, but all of them, to one extent or another, have their uses. And with the sheer amount of options the game throws at you, this is impressive in and of itself. Most of the time in games of this scope, there are dump stats, useless skills, and so on, but here, Tides of Numenera seems to make judicious use of almost every possible build. This has to be one of my favorite mechanics in the game. See, instead of doing something like the newer Fallout games where the dialogue options you want to use are locked out because your stats aren't high enough to use them, and to a greater extent, the earlier Fallouts where certain text options wouldn't even appear, Numenera allows you to take the chance, but at the cost of your stat pools. See, in a lot of RPGs, stats are permanent for the most part, and if they rise every level, it is likely that they don't affect much outside of your effectiveness in combat. In Tides of Numenera, every time you level, you have the options to raise various stats and skills. Stat pools are interesting because they act like a form of hit points, action points, and so on. When in combat, certain skills will cost you might points, which is basically your strength. Some will cost speed, and others, like magic or esoteries as the game calls them, cost you intellect. Once you exhaust this pool, your effectiveness with these skills is decreased and you become much less accurate with those skills. The other side of this is dialogue. When in dialogue, you'll be presented with many options that can help you solve various problems. But those options have a very low chance to succeed by themselves unless you spend points from your stat pool to raise your chance of success. Unlike in a game like Baldur's Gate, where your characters can swing their swords and fight monsters all day without getting tired or exhausted, Tides of Numenera make you feel like you are balancing the effort of battle with survival. If you exhaust your resources, you might be left defenseless. In dialogue, you might come up against an obstacle that you cannot solve unless you rest, and this is one of the things I would like to complain about for one moment. Sleeping in this game breaks the balance almost completely. Sure, there's only one place that I know of to rest in the opening area of the game, but it is a simple thing to go there and heal whenever you come to deplete your stat points. It only costs 20 shins in the first area to rest completely for each person in your group. Now you would think that once you get a full group together that this cost might get prohibitive. And you would be right, except for the fact that You can use anyone in your group stat pools to clear an obstacle or sweet talk someone into getting what you need, which stretches out the time you need to heal. This can also be compounded if you are, say, a nano who only focuses on intellect. You can build a character who focuses on that, and through leveling something called edge, you can stretch your intellect pools even further, hardly ever needing to sleep, which cuts down on running back and forth, but it creates an interesting problem. While I generally felt good in dialogue every time a speech check, perception, lore, or other skill check succeeded in dialogue, I never stopped to consider whether or not I should pump all my intellect into a check or try to save it, because I never felt like I was in danger of wasting it all. I feel like that should have been taken into consideration when designing a system like this. You want your player to have to carefully consider his or her choices. To compound this problem, I can count the battles I had to partake in on merely 2 hands, and if you're good at min-maxing your stats, dumping points and money for items into what your character does best, the combat becomes a joke. For me, the average fight in Numenera lasted about 10 minutes, and I would say, all in all, it equals about maybe, in a single player playthrough, about 2 hours of combat. With less reliance on combat and a heavy reliance on choices made through text, you may find yourself with a whole lot of resources on your hands, able to splurge on whatever awesome artifacts catch your eye in the various shops. It sort of destroys any small amount of challenge the game would have had if the combat was more involved. Now, I thought all of this up until I reached a bloom and stupidly spent all my money, my health, and my intellect pool. I was in a hostile, sentient environment known to feed on those it found interesting, and every character I spoke to told me just how interesting the bloom found me. In this state, I felt pressure. I felt like every speech check suddenly became more and more important. The desire to save scum almost took me down the path to the dark side many times, and I was presented with the choice of paying a mutant to keep them from killing the Memovira's thugs after failing a speech check that drained my entire intellect pool. I seriously considered just letting them kill each other. I didn't, however, and I paid the price in my constant fear and tension that lingered around me like a bad smell until I was able to scrape together enough money to rest. Now this is Tides of Numenera at its best. It's just a shame that it took so long to get to that point, and a double shame that once I passed that hurdle, the game literally showered me in shins, and all that tension that had been building up was completely destroyed when I looked at my bank account and saw that I had 5,000 shins in there. Effort and edge is a neat little idea, and every level in the game forces you to think for a little while about how you would like to advance your character. Do I want my character to have a larger stat pool, or do I want to use more of my stat pools with each action I take? Maybe I want to expend less of my stat pool every time I use effort. It is an interesting choice. Extra effort allows you to do things like expend more intellect on an esoteric attack, thus increasing your chance to hit from distance, as well as do far more damage per round. But for extremely difficult tasks, it also gives you a better chance of succeeding, which is incredibly important since some of the more important tasks don't give you a second chance to fail at them. Edge allows you to expend effort without any cost to your stat pools, which can effectively make some skills free to use under certain circumstances. This also compounds the problem we were talking about before, where there's even less incentive to care about expending all of your effort to maximize dialogue and combat checks. Still, it feels like a better reward for leveling. I know a designer is doing something right when I have to stop leveling for a moment and think about what I really need and or want from my character, and ask myself questions like, who is this person I've been playing as? This is what I affectionately call the potatoes of the game, and I mean that in a good way, because we haven't really gotten to what I would rightly call the meat of the game. First time I played the game, I played as a nano intellect build, which means that the skills I chose to focus on drew from that pool. So for instance, lore skills, perception, deception, and so on. Pile on esoteries for attacks, and I ended up having roughly 20 intellect in my stat pool by the time I reached a bloom. In my first playthrough, there was very nearly a speech check for every dialogue option I engaged in, and almost every problem could be solved through the use of these skills in one way or another. It really felt like this is the way the game was meant to be played, especially coming from a writer like Chris Avallone, who I'm used to having written very involved dialogue and excellent stories. I never considered for one moment taking a glaive or a jack, and pumping resources into speed or might. And the game actively encourages this by making weapons that also use intellect to use in combat. When I went to re-roll a might character, I was afraid that the game would lose all of its charm. that quest wouldn't be as interesting because the idea of smashing everything I saw seemed silly. And I was sure that a low intellect build would not result in a Fallout-like set of mush-brain dialogue options. And for the most part I was right. There are no different options if you don't have high intellect. But that isn't necessarily a bad thing. See, the role-playing in this game is more focused around the tides. It's not about who your character is, it's about what your character does. So let's talk about the tides. The tides on the surface seem like just another morality system. And what they turn out to be is, yes, it's another morality system, but that doesn't necessarily make it a bad system. What they have done here is, instead of having you pick from choices that will increase the tide you want, sticking to a strictly good or evil type of playstyle, the tides are a bit more ambiguous than all that. The tides are represented by colors. Each color represents a personality type. Blue represents those that seek enlightenment through wisdom and mysticism. Their goal is to expand their knowledge of truth and the world around them through the realm of the mind. Red represents fire, the fire of passion and emotion. The ability to act without thinking, to experience without fear, to live life to the fullest. The indigo tide is the tide of justice for the greater good. They view life in terms of an action's effect on a broad range of people as opposed to the individual effect. The gold tide is the tide of the humanitarian, the type of person who gives homeless people money, or pays for a stripper's rent because he hopes one day that she'll settle down and marry him. And the silver tide is Donald Trump. Now, I'm not a fan of signposting in dialogue. I think I've made that clear, but why? Well, I think that signposting dialogue tends to railroad you, the player, down a specific choice of dialogue in the interest of maintaining your dominant tide. See, at first the game doesn't tell you if dialogue is going to change your tide, and it's in these moments when I find myself thinking about what is the best option to say, because I want to maintain my tide, but I also want to say what I think is right. This to me is the best way to do dialogue, because when you tell someone beforehand what an option will do for them before they do it, you take the risk and the mystery out of the choice. When I got a little further into the game, it suddenly started signposting most of its dialogue, and I found myself less thinking about the options I was choosing and more picking the option that wouldn't shift my tide, even when it was an option I didn't want to pick. I later, upon realizing I was doing this, opted to ignore the tides and ignore the system in general, because up to this point, tides meant nothing. And by then, I was already out of Sagas Cliff exploring new areas. It didn't feel like tides meant anything other than the value that I, the player, was foisting upon it. It seems like, instead of tides being some interesting mechanic in the game, it was simply a gimmick carried over from the pen and paper game that seemed, up to that point, to only affect dialogue options in very limited circumstances. Once I realized this, I no longer paid it any mind. I work as a research lab tech, and I think I know where this option came from in games. It came from a need to please people who don't normally play RPGs and games like Dragon Age, Mass Effect, and Modern Fallout. When participants complain that dialogue is too long and I just want to get back into the action, designers look for ways to hurry the player through the dialogue to get them back into what each individual enjoys. It is the way that you appeal to the mass market. Unfortunately for Tides of Numenera, the people playing this game are there for the dialogue, because it certainly isn't the combat. So on instinct, I went into the game's options and saw that there was a way to turn off Tide's feedback. See, I was overjoyed. I thought that meant that you could turn off the signposting. What it actually was, is that you don't get that satisfying sound effect or that color flashing across your portrait when your tides shift. Now, why the fuck would anyone want to do this? So it was weird. So much of this game smacks of needing polish, editing. For instance, it seems that leaving tide warnings in dialogue choices wasn't a conscious effort on their part. It looks like they were just going to have all the options labeled but gave up halfway through. That is at first glance. Now, see, what is actually happening here is that you are presented with a choice at a certain part of the game. And if you make a certain choice, you gain a follower. A sentient jelly monster. He is what is actually telling you what will happen in your title alignment if you take him along with you. He is tied inextricably to your mind. When you speak with him, he speaks directly to your mind, through images, since he lacks words to communicate. I had no idea what was happening until I spoke with him and tried to understand what he was all about. This also ties into the themes of the game. The themes of the game are a mechanic of the game. You learn about the game by engaging in the very thing that the game is preaching to you about the entire time. It's fantastically put together. Curiosity is almost always rewarded, even if your curiosity leads you to failure. Also, small subtle changes to dialogue happen as well that I didn't quite notice there at first, which I will go into in more depth later on in this video. This game is about becoming the master of your mind. The theme throughout the game is about unlocking the memories of a god that once inhabited your body. When talking to the mysterious form in your mind, it became obvious, at least to me at first, that this person must be the changing god, or what is left of him, hiding in our mind from the sorrows that hunt him. If we believe that nothing is on accident and everything is on purpose, he is the other part of us that keeps our memories from us. This game catches a lot of flack for not being as good as Planescape, and I will admit the characters are not nearly as interesting, but the game shares many themes. Both games are about remembering what the previous incarnation of yourself did. Both games feature a character suffering from a form of repairable amnesia. Both games treat dialogue and the adventure aspects of the game as moments to teach the player about the fragility of the mind and how our minds shape reality, though I will argue that Tides of Numenera doubles down on this and makes it its focus. Another similarity between the two games is in the design of the areas. In Planescape Torment, you were cordoned off at first from all other areas of the game. You were gated by milestones, which usually resulted in you learning something very important about yourself and your past, and the City of Doors would literally reshape itself as you shape your memories. In Numenera, you are also locked into a small part of the game world. I suspect that this may be what turned off some players who were unfamiliar with these types of games. Most games now turn you loose in a large open world and let you explore at will, and this has an immense impact on how your players will experience the story. Since you cannot in any meaningful way gate the player off from the story, side quests cannot contain any relevant information about your main objective. These games are often not about one central theme, but about self-contained themes that only reinforce their own ideas. The result is fragmented, but it works in its own way. The strength of a game like Numenera is in the control it exerts over what content the player can consume at once. By doing this, the game can linger on themes for a much longer time, and when you linger on a theme, the audience looks forward to that much more to the conclusion of the conflict which drives those themes. For instance, the theme in Numenera is about creation, chaos, and how we are all connected by the experience and memories we create from interacting with each other. If you can control a subset of side quests that can be experienced, you can finally craft a story that lingers on certain themes and reveals the deeper meanings of those themes as the story unravels one piece at a time. Planescape Torment had almost identical themes and was designed in much the same way. Both games also featured a character named O. He is a creature both real and unreal, existing only in the mind and unseeable to all but those he wishes to see him. In both games, O imparts wisdom to your character, and as a result raises your intellect pool in Numenera and the wisdom of the Nameless One in Planescape. He has no love for mortals, as he sees them much like we see insects, but at the same time sees the potential in us to grow into truth. The problem is that our lives are too short. We do not live long enough to grow our knowledge of reality, and what we have learned dies with us. This could be why he only speaks to the immortals, both the Nameless One and us, the changing god. The biggest issue I have with most RPGs made by both AAA studios and by some indie devs is a lack of identity. With the openness of worlds and the explore at will mentality, we give the player freedom at the cost of narrative tightness. Tides of Numenera feeds you content in large enough chunks that a measure of freedom exists in that you can choose to tackle a quest in any order you see fit. But there is only one way through the story. If you wish to see more, to know more about the world, you must finish the task at hand. A game like Tides of Numenera is a bit like reading a book a few chapters at a time, but out of order, while a game like Skyrim is like picking a page out of a book at random. It is easy to learn about the lore, factions, and story out of order, which can produce a bit of confusion in the player. Then again, the way that Numenera tells a story is also a bit front-loaded, and I found myself confused by what was exactly going on at any time. For instance, you are introduced to the Children of the Endless Circle early on in a mission in the Underbelly. I knew very little about this group, and what I did know essentially boiled down to that the Dendro, her are weird, but the children are far worse. As the game progressed and I eventually left Sagas Cliffs, I was reintroduced to the group, but since I had done this mission so early on and knew so very little about them, I had lost track of who they were. Numenera was quick, however, to remind me to get me back up to speed, and once the story started focusing on the cult, the questline was that much more fascinating. The game has a goal: to fix the Resonance Chamber. That goal takes you through the entirety of the game and never deviates from that goal. This is important because in most well-crafted stories, the goal rarely changes until the point when the character gets what they need. When they do get the thing that they desire, it's quite common for the character to find out that this was not what they wanted all along, or that what they wanted was with them all along. Numenera takes this type of storytelling, which is the same type of story crafted for Planescape, and executes it with the expertise in a way that I haven't seen since in that game. Oftentimes in RPGs, the theme is either weak, or the theme is non-existent. For an example of this, look at Dragon Age Inquisition. We are presented with a problem. We are suspected of being the person who killed the MacGuffin and opened a portal in the sky. We don't really feel a threat from any of this because the people in charge, with very little convincing, are immediately on our side. Now this is one of those world ender plots that I've talked about in my on-writing videos. Notice that in a movie like Guardians of the Galaxy, we were presented with the world-ending plot at the end of the movie, and in my opinion, was the least interesting part of the whole thing. Everything leading up to that had a central theme that was tying it all together, and that was family. Now think about this. Is there a central, one-word theme that you can think of for all of Dragon Age Inquisition that it follows throughout its entire story? Because I can't. I can think of many themes, but none of them are lingered upon long enough to make the story interesting. We have racism, classism, justice, betrayal, loyalty, fear, but we never linger on any one idea long enough to have it matter in any substantial way that would influence the story. This is what I call plot ADD. Whenever the story gets boring, throw in some more ideas. We'll worry about tying all that shit up later. Tides of Numenera lingers on the idea of change through the power of the mind for the entirety of the story. We linger on it for so long, and these ideas are so well reinforced that we can easily come to understand, given enough time in-game, even the most obtuse, metaphysical, and spiritual ideas that the game puts forth. I mean, some of these ideas are absolutely out there, but we easily buy into them because the theme is never deviated from, never undermined. For example, even war is framed by Adaris as a waste of life and talent that could be better spent learning how to communicate better with one another. When she asked me what I thought of the war, I answered that I agreed, but that both sides believe that they're doing what is right to protect our brethren, the cast-offs. She asked what I would say if she told me that it harmed them more than protected them, and I answered again in the same way. This was a thought experiment. The idea that in trying to protect, we do harm to those that we protect, just like any civil war. Both sides believe that their position on the matter is the only true, right position, and they have come to this conclusion because of their experiences, good or bad, with the changing God. One side believes he must be stopped, and one side believes he should be worshipped. Both sides believe. Both sides fight for those beliefs, and in doing so, they destroy the very thing that they fight to protect. The mind has shaped this war, and the beliefs that the mind clings to, in spite of reason, perpetuate it. Adaris compounds possible issues with altering the memories and thus reality by making us think on the implications of our actions, no matter the intention behind them, that even a humanitarian can cause harm when their actions are good intention if a lack of information and truth is had about any given situation. Helping one can hurt the other. I'm reminded of a scene from Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic Part 2. You give money to a man down on his luck, and Kreia speaks to you through the Force. She says,
"Why did you do such a thing? Such kindnesses will mean nothing. His path is set. Giving him what he has not earned is like pouring sand into his hands. And would that be a kindness? What if by surviving another day he brings a greater darkness upon another? The Force binds all things. The slightest push, the smallest touch, sends echoes throughout life. Even an act of kindness may have more severe repercussions than you know or can see. By giving him something he has not earned, perhaps all you have helped him become is a target." seeing another elevated often brings the eyes of others who suffer. And perhaps in the end, all you have wrought is more pain. And that is my lesson to you. Be careful of charity and kindness, lest you do more harm with open hands than with a clenched fist.
Our lesson is that by interfering with the natural order of things, we act like a pebble dropped into still water. Our ripples can become the wave that drowns the ant on the shoreline. The question is it better to sit and watch as nature takes its course, or intervene and do what we think is best? Adaris's point, then, is how can we assume we know enough to make the right decision? Is the right decision right because it feels right? What if what feels right causes others pain? In other words, did we do what we thought was right because it was right, or because it made us feel good to do so? Is that selfish? And this is where the game gets its main theme. What does one life matter? These are deep themes rarely explored in modern RPGs, and the state of this style of game is all the more sadder for its loss. It is often said that reality is perception, but you cannot physically shape reality with your mind. This is not only possible in Tides of Numenera, but it is, I argue, the entire point. At the start of the game, when you are born and crash to the earth, you die. We are trapped inside of our mind in a sort of regenerative coma, struggling to reclaim a piece of who we were before we were cast from the clouds. Globes of light guide us to memories detached from ourselves. Memories from people who are not us, but were us. The us we once were, the changing God. In those memories, we can choose our path. We can choose how we remember those events. And because we can choose those events have suddenly happened the way we remember them. It is as if we are writing a bit of history, simply because we remembered it a certain way, and this is how the brain and memory work. If you remember an event a certain way, to you, that is truly how it happened, which is why eyewitness testimony is so unreliable. No memory is ever perfect, save for some photographic memory. But this series of events tells us something else about the world of Numenera. It doesn't matter what really happened in those memories, because no matter what you choose, that is how it happened. I don't know if this choice was meant to have this kind of impact, but it did. And if it was an accident, it was a happy accident, because it fits perfectly with all the themes of memory this game explores. The mind controls our perception of reality. What we see is filtered through all of our various experiences and biases, and all of this informs how we see things and events and motivates us in our world. If we have forgotten who we are, forgotten what we have done, then in a way, we are no longer the same person. Does that assuage us of the guilt for the actions of a man we no longer know and objectively no longer are?
No, really. Memory's not perfect. It's not even that good. Ask the police. Eyewitness testimony is unreliable.
Tides of Numenera tackles this question in a short side quest with a frightened man named Finzen, who is stalked by a levy. First, it's important to know what a levy is. A levy is so much more than a mere city guard. Though they provide that function, they are the physical manifestation of a single year in a citizen's life. A citizen, for their sacrifice, is granted citizenship and all the perks that come with it, but they are stripped of a year of that person's life, their memories, their experiences, all of it. And with that year, the levy is given life. But what if the year they take is a bad year? A twisted year spent committing horrible deeds or having those horrible deeds acted upon you. The levy becomes twisted, becomes obsessed with the creature that gave it birth. In the case of this levy, it follows its father carrying around a charred toy, a child's toy. In the year that the man gave up, he had burned a block down, killed many people in a fire in order to escape capture for a robbery he took part in. Of course, Finzen doesn't remember the deed and outright denies that it ever happened, but that is because that year was given up to the levy. The levy wants another year from Finzen, a year that doesn't hurt so much, a year that he can live with, but that cost is just too high for Finzen, and he's unwilling to lose yet another. Now you have two options. You can talk to the captain of the guard and the levy will be destroyed. Or you can go through the arduous task of creating a new memory, sacrificing your intellect pool to make both a memory and creating a cipher to bind it to it. Both of these options net the same physical reward, so there's no real incentive to do one over the other. The choice is up to you, the player, to roleplay the character you wish to play without being tempted by a greater or lesser reward for doing the right or wrong thing. The game doesn't manipulate you in any way to get you to do what you want with rewards. It manipulates you more on an emotional level. In this way, it's a great role-playing game that deserves far more attention and credit than it received. In the dialogue, you're often asked who you are. You have the option to lie, which is often marked with ellipses as a lie. Two other options are usually, I'm a cast off of the Changing God, or I am the Changing God. Calling yourself the Changing God is not marked as a lie, because in this game's opinion, reality is what you say it is. When you call yourself the Changing God, your tide shifts to silver. The silver tide is attuned to those who seek fame and recognition. It is for the egotistical or fame-hungry. Talking to Sylph and calling herself the Changing God, she recites a riddle. What comes in with breath and out with a word transmutes upon death, but cannot be conferred. The answer is consciousness. The reason being is that when we die, all that is left of us are the stories that people tell of our actions, but a man's consciousness, his thoughts, his experiences, and how that has shaped him throughout a life can never be passed on. We lose so much when we lose a life. We lose the particular way that Einstein thought through his problems because we lost his particular way of looking at things. Lost to the void forever, never to be another. Sylph has transferred her consciousness into a machine, and by extension of this action, became immortal. She, unlike the fragile, meaty, fleshy things, will not lose her consciousness and experience to the void. Her mind will continue to expand while others will slowly rot with age. However, she seems to be of two minds. One that is furious at us, and one that seeks to control that fury, each consciousness giving way to one another and forgetting what the other has done. Her, like most of the themes in this game, is there to remind us of what we are doing in the world. We are there to regain who we are and take control of our mind. Our mind, not the Changing Gods, but whatever we become when we have achieved our ends. Sylph appears, once we fully remember her, to be a pleasure model robot, and the consciousness trapped inside of her, wresting control from her in her weaker moments, is the mind of the pimp that wished to sell her to us. Then in the Order of Truth you meet Salamary, someone who our previous incarnation apparently had very carnal relationships with. We apparently left a mark on her. She remembers us, misses us in her own way, but when you do her a favor, and do so without killing the drones that buzz inside the structure, simply saying thank you to her prompts her to say the following. "You're welcome," she says at last. "You're quite different from your father, you know." So we have established that we can believe that we are the Changing God even if it isn't true. Even though the game doesn't tell us it isn't true, and even with all of that, we can be seen as someone else simply through our actions. We are different because of what we do, to be sure, but it is a contradiction. We are different than the Changing God even though we are him, or once were him. The mind and our actions, and our thoughts, and our words change who we are. That change can come at any time, thus, instead of an alignment like this game being black and white, names like good or evil or neutral, they're called tides, for the whims of our personality can change like the tides in an ocean. I believe the reason that you're able to both deny your godhood and claim it is because both statements are true. You can either be fame-hungry, self-proclaimed God, or you can deny the heritage left behind by past yous and become something else. You, both, are and are not the Changing God, vacillating between the two states, the two tides of gold and silver, of humanity and lust of power. The only thing calming the chaos of the tides are your consistent actions, or your inconsistent actions which cause turbulence within the tides. I've included a link to a helpful table that was created by Adam Hine, a developer at In Exile, that was used to describe the tides in great detail. It is a very interesting read and I highly recommend it to any player who is new to the game and wishes to understand the philosophy behind the tides. It's interesting because it brings us to what the game does best. It tells us who our characters are through our actions in game. I've not seen another purpose for this particular system in the game other than that, to tell you who your character is through the choices you make. If you're playing as I feel most are, as an idealized version of yourself, then you are playing as the person you strive in your daily life to be. The person that is just out of your reach. The you that you wish people saw. All of this, however, seems to depend on your title alignment. I noticed that the longer I played the game, the further I got away from being silver. And eventually I started to become gold aligned. Once I became gold aligned, I noticed that when people asked me if I was the Changing God, suddenly that choice is marked as a lie. So if I am aligned to silver, my boastful, braggart attitude made me, and everyone around me, believe that I was the Changing God, whether it was true or not. Further, playing into the theme that the game wants you to get across, which is, you are who you think you are. There is a skill in Tides of Numenera called anamnesis. It means to recollect. At various sections in the game, you are presented with the option of remembering how you know certain people that you've never met before because you are not the owner of your body. Someone else was. Anamnesis also has a connection to Christianity in that it represents the passion and sacrifice of Christ, and the Greek word roughly translates to memorial sacrifice. It should be no surprise then that the act of anamnesis in the game is in direct relation to remembering the actions and deeds of the changing God. We are the changing God's creation. We are literally the star sent from heaven, fallen to earth, given birth without the dirtiness and shame attached to sex, nor the pleasure. Our birth is one of pain, sudden death, and resurrection. We are often called a cast off by the non-believers and believers alike, but to those that were close to the changing God, we are called his son. Our character therefore can be like Christ in the eyes of some men, or like Satan in the eyes of others depending on what we've done to them. Our thoughts are not our own. Instead, they are like communications from God telling us our own mistakes, informing us like our parents do, teaching us through their example, showing us that we should strive to be different than they were, to not make their mistakes. The other side of this is that, while we can shape our reality through our decisions and our memories, the memories of others also shape us. We are, like reality, what others perceive us to be. All of this is why Tides of Numenera is my RPG of 2017. And this has been a rant from Strat-Edgy, and now that you've heard it, go play some games. And I know it's been a while since I've done one of these kind of videos. This was a mammoth undertaking. The game itself is, at least 36 hours long. And I found myself just writing about the things and themes and whatnot in this game. Hope you guys enjoy it. If you feel so inclined, subscribe, give the video a like, and if you want to see more of this kind of content, feel free to donate on Patreon. I will not be charging for videos for quite a while. I think that when I do, it'll probably be on a monthly basis. Once we reach a certain threshold for the channel, once it's possible actually for me to turn off ads entirely, then I'll start charging the patrons. The next video will be another on writing video. It'll be about Rocky. Yeah, the movie Rocky. I recently saw a video about how someone thought that Rocky had no structure, and I thought that was complete bollocks, as the people over the pond say, so I've done a sort of retort to it, so look out for that. Until next time, peace out, later.